Changing lanes. Esmeralda brushes her hair back with that lucky single flick of her wrist and then stares into thin air, as if to bring the subject back to her rather gorgeous form. Dobbs needs no encouragement, and allowing his gaze to drop down to the delicate pale skin around her neck and just above her breasts, he lets his eyes travel slowly down the length of her body, as if on a journey. She cocks her head to see where he's going, and he tries hard not to pause at any long, awkward places. At last, descending down the delicate slopes of her magnificent thighs, he finally comes to stop at his pisco sour, sitting at her feet. It appears almost in double now, and Dobbs has to shake his head to bring his vision back into a singularity. For a moment he's lost for words, but suddenly two just pop into his head. He pulls out his phone and casually selects voice recorder, then presses the green button and pops the device back into his top pocket. Without a decent microphone, the device only really picks up his own voice in a muffled sort of way, but that will be all he really needs to bring about some memory of events, he figures. Agent 6 observes what he's just done and, winking at him, shouts across to Esmeralda, "You know, Dobbs is writing a book." "Oh?" she says, suddenly interested. "About what?" Dobbs stops almost in freeze frame. Given her stance on drugs, he's wary of telling her the book is actually about a very odd blast of nitrous oxide. "Well, funny you should mention it, but about the Catholic Church, actually." Esmeralda's shoulders drop with the anticlimax of the comment, and then she pops her head up and looks at Dobbs. "You don't like Catholics, right?" "No, not at all. I mean, yes, I love Catholics. I went all the way to Calcutta just to kiss Mother Teresa's hand once," he says with genuine sincerity. She pulls a face that suggests disbelief, but no indication of any amusement, not that Dobbs was even trying to be funny. "No, I really did." "And did you kiss her hand?" she says, twisting her body away from Dobbs, who senses she has her guards up even higher now. "Yeah, but she snatched it right back. She was all about total service, really. She wanted absolutely no gratitude whatsoever. She was the genuine article, wasn't she? A proper saint, Catholic or not. My mum used to tell me the story of Francis of Assisi when I was really young too. And honestly, I'd cry every time she told me the end of it. The bit when he breaks through past all the, well, church security, I suppose, and gets to the Pope to ask for his blessing. That he could kiss the Pope's feet. That the Pope would ordain the tiny church he'd built in Assisi. She loved telling me how the Pope looked upon him dressed in his rags and how he just dropped to his knees and kissed St. Francis' feet. So no, I don't hate Catholics. There's good and bad in everything, right?" For a moment Esmeralda says nothing, observing him warily. She's obviously trying to work him out and where he's going with this. "I love the story of Francis of Assisi. It's my favourite story," she finally whispers. "Kind of mine too, I guess." Dobbs tries to hide his relief and decides to take a different track. "So what, you're telling me you don't really break the rules?" "That's not me trying to get you into bed. Just curious, really. You got the look of a rule breaker more than a rule maker," he says, grinning wolfishly. She squirms slightly, but to his relief, she grins too. "Now you're making fun of me." Dobbs is impressed. All of a sudden she's leaning back in the sun lounger and looking more relaxed, like she's feeling back in control. Plus she's got a glint of something else in those eyes, something more mischievous perhaps. "Yeah, I break the rules sometimes," she smiles, running her finger round the rim of her glass. "So what are you writing a book about then? Catholics, really?" More drinks get delivered by the management, but Dobbs knows he needs to go easy now. So placing his half-finished cocktail on the floor, he hands out the latest delivery, then as soon as the manager disappears, relights the spliff and passes it to Esmeralda. He doesn't point out the obvious fact that spliff is technically a drug also. "Well, it's about a guy who travels to South America, well, to the Amazon actually, to find the origin of Shakespeare." "So Shakespeare came from the Amazon, did he?" Esmeralda grins, arching her eyebrows as she pulls her weight more onto the sun lounger they're both sitting on. She's definitely starting to relax now. Her English is perfect, and she clearly enjoys speaking it. Plus she doesn't make Dobbs feel like a total idiot for his lack of proficiency in her mother tongue. "Well, maybe not Shakespeare directly," he says, beginning to get into his stride. "But I reckon he might have had a boding spirit, like Ariel in The Tempest. You know the character I mean? The one who does Prospero's bidding. The one who creates the storm, the tempest, that brings all of wronged Prospero to the shores of his tiny island, where he enacts his final judgment upon them." He pauses, taking a cautious sip of his drink. "So perhaps Shakespeare's own boding spirit was from the Amazon? I mean, I don't know for sure, but that's where the main character in my story goes to find the only thing he believes that can stop World War III. "It's fiction then," she says, dragging her thumb down the narrow glass until it stops with a tiny screech. Well, it loosely follows a true story. Very loosely, of course, but yet, total fiction, really. At this point, the brigadier, who's been getting increasingly agitated, suddenly jumps up. "I'm going to get some pizza. We need food," he declares, pacing. He looks at Perlita, the girl with the mousy hair. "Come on, let's go and grab some pizzas." He brings his attention back to Dobbs and Agent 6. "Shall we all chuck in for some pizza then?" Dobbs looks over at the brigadier, then Perlita. "You going with Perlita?" he says finally. There's a moment of awkward silence, and then Perlita shouts, "Si, vámonos." Agent 6 and Dobbs chuck the brigadier some cash for food, and immediately he goes, taking the girl with him. The energy becomes noticeably calmer as he leaves, but Dobbs and Agent 6 catch each other's eye briefly as the pair disappear. For a moment, everyone seems to be contemplating whether that was actually the best move, and Dobbs, closing his eyes, surreptitiously places a golden ring of protection around the two of them in his mind's eye before directing his attention back to Esmeralda. It's a little technique he'd started adopting many years ago, something he may soon have to depend on more than he might ever believe. Of course, the proof of all these things will never live in his doubt, as ultimately, the proof is always in the pudding. But if the proof of a psychic level of protection that could help you sail through some of the most intense bouts of self-doubt, that are like storms, full-blown tempests of utter doubt that can tear apart a human being and take them to the depths of despair, lies only in the pudding, then it kind of begs the question, where does doubt lie? Of course, if you take that question, as in quest I on, to the breadth of this world, it's not where does doubt lie, or indeed, what is doubt? It's simply, who is doubt, if it's not actually you? "So you're really writing a book about Shakespeare?" Esmeralda asks in a fashion as though she senses she might be opening a can of worms. "No, I'm writing a story about how I became a Catholic." "No." "You see, that was the only bit of the whole story that was unbelievable, wasn't it? Everything else is totally believable apart from me becoming Catholic. You see, you were brought up Catholic, right? You were born into it. Tony Blair's the only person I've ever heard of that officially joined up. I mean, I'm sure people do, but it just doesn't seem very believable, does it?" Esmeralda shakes her head, wondering where he's going. "So what? You're going to brush up on your Spanish and present yourself as some intellectual travelling scholar, and I'm going to be your token Catholic, right?" Her tone is fiery and makes her Hispanic accent more seductive to Dobbs than the one of anger. "Oh, come on, that's not fair. You seem pretty cool to me." "I don't know, it's your family religion. I'm not poking the judgment stick at those that follow in faith, Catholic or otherwise. I'm merely concerned with those with genocide in their heads, rather than love in their hearts." Esmeralda's clearly feeling distinctly uncomfortable to have her religion placed at the forefront of the conversation again, but she did kind of bring it up, Dobbs thinks to himself. "So why does he go to the Amazon to find Shakespeare then?" Dobbs considers for a moment, unsure whether it's a good idea to mention the word ayahuasca in the light of her avowed stance towards drugs. Well, Shakespeare ends up representing the origin of something that might have saved Britain hundreds of years ago, when the Catholics were about to bring the Spanish Inquisition to British shores, he says, eventually deciding to play things safe. "What? Shakespeare?" "Well, what Shakespeare represents." "Which is what?" "Well, a miracle." Esmeralda doesn't look impressed. "A miracle? Well, back in those days, everything seemed to have gone past any point of hope. The tipping point had come and long since gone. It was one of those times in history when a miracle was the only option left on the table." "What, and then Shakespeare came along and saved everyone?" "Well, not quite. It's a bit of an odd thing, really. You see, I'd written this silly little kind of play, a tongue-in-cheek performance for a nightclub-type environment, to be performed on the night of the election in 2005, and telling the story of a man who builds a machine that can not only turn rubbish into gold, but it can even recycle all the wasted votes. It was a late-night show, so it was a bit rude, well, very rude actually. You know, lots of tunes and late-night banter for an audience that are pissed out of their skulls. I guess I wanted to create the type of energy you see in those old paintings of the theatre antics of Shakespeare's time. Everyone's screaming out, a mob, rather than the incredibly boring scene of people sitting in comfortable chairs looking like they're at home watching the bloody TV again. Anyway, so I wrote this play, One for Sorrow. It was an experiment, but it went well. One of my mates, Hicksy, who'd helped me write the play, come up with another script that captured that same kind of crazy energy, a Shakespeare parody complete with all the banter, like a piss take of The Tempest. It was a fantastic script, but I didn't know the original story. I'd never read any Shakespeare in my life. So my mate gave me a children's version of the story. Because I just couldn't get my head around the original tale. It was like another language. Honestly, I fell in love with the tale. It's a beautiful story, a story steeped in treachery and deceit that ends in, well, forgiveness. I guess because I didn't know the story, I couldn't really begin to connect the dots until I read the play. And then I read my mate's play again, and I loved it even more. It portrayed Tony Blair as Proslero, the peace envoy, wielding his magic book of manifestos. Well, the purpose of this book I want to write is to actually make the play happen. Ironically, I've tried so many options, I think I've gone round the houses a bit. Here he pauses. Like you like your Shakespeare, Esmeralda says, still sounding a little unsure. Like I say, I've still only read one of his original plays, but I've always had a fascination with the story of Shakespeare. Well, for many years anyway. It was all a much bigger thing, you know. But as I dug into the research, I started uncovering a story of another tempest that had happened just before Shakespeare's time, the tempest that destroyed the Spanish Armada. And I started to realise that Shakespeare's play was inspired by that great storm, the one that destroyed that Spanish Armada. Right, Esmeralda sounds doubtful. She's clearly intelligent and is still showing signs that she thinks this is likely to turn out as an attack on her religious roots. Imagine that time in England. The country was broken and on its knees. All our medicine women were being burnt as witches. And our scholars and poets and writers executed for blasphemy. The Catholics permitted absolutely no freedom of speech, just like they did here in South America. The country was being torn apart, so Henry VIII, King of England, your king who loved killing his wives. Yes, the very same, although I don't think it was quite as simple as that. Bear in mind that those were arranged marriages, Esmeralda, strategic affairs that set the course of who owned what. These were rarely unions of love, I suspect. Perhaps being a psychopath isn't that simple. And she moves her posture away from Dobbs, but that seductive tone is back. I'm not condoning it. It's just in the background of his legacy. The Renaissance that had really started in Germany was kicking off across Europe. It was an uprising. So the Catholics were carrying out the Inquisition, almost as a kind of act of redemption for this evil awakening that was sweeping the land. People were dying in their thousands. He takes a sip of his cocktail. So Henry broke England away from the Catholic Church because it was hindering any type of development. The country was being divided and suppressed. Did you know that Henry reinstated the right of herbal medicine to be a legal practice, for instance? In one single bill, a whole healthcare system that the Catholics had banned as evil was reinstated. It's harsh, I know. He must have known that there would be a massive reprisal. And it wasn't just happening in England. The Renaissance was happening right across Europe. This coming back to the great Gnostic teachings of Christ, not peddled through some third-party priest class, but found deep within your own heart. He half chuckles, knowing that she's listening now. But England breaking away from the Catholic stronghold came with certainty of massive backlash. So Henry executing his wives was okay. You just dismiss that, she suddenly exclaims, as though he just sailed clean past the issue like a politician. No, I'm just trying to understand the motivations of the man at the helm of a country that's being torn to bits by religious extremists, using what they define as love and light to create the divisions between every faction of society. The reality is that Henry just wanted a son to take the helm after him when retribution finally came for his split from the Catholic Church. And when that day did come and the Great Armada finally did set sail to bring the Inquisition to English shores, who did he leave?
A woman? Yeah, a woman. Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, a frail woman by all accounts too. She knew what the Spanish were intent bringing to England, not just taking lives. That was too easy. No, every life that was taken was used as a means to drive greater terror into the populace, astounding torture. The only intention of that armada, to take lives in the hundreds of thousands, destroy Henry's legacy and reverse the awakening with war. He pauses again, looking at her and wondering if it's hurt he sees in her face. We're not talking about Catholicism really, are we, Esmeralda? We're just talking about human evolution. You see, there was no way such an armada carrying such an army could have been stopped. It was the biggest fleet to ever set sail, even in today's terms. Nearly all the troops were already in France, just waiting to be ferried across the English Channel and right onto the battlefield to begin the killing. Yet barely one of those ships, if any, touched English shores. Half were destroyed by a fire, born of an act of faith on the part of the English captains to burn their own ships at the whim of England's arch-wizard, Dr. John Dee. And indeed, a wind just blew up from nowhere and took the burning ships straight into the dock fleet. It was the ultimate naval faux pas. Never bring your fleet together and take them out of battle formation, unless you really want to lose them. He sips his cocktail, warming to his theme, then continues. The other half of the fleet just cut their anchors to get away from the terrible wall of burning ships that consumed everything in its path. But without those anchors they couldn't stop, and a tempest just blew them all away, and perhaps showed them the suffering they wanted to show England. The few who survived the disaster told of the most cruel conditions, disease, bitter cold, sickness and starvation. Even when they got round to Ireland, the Irish wanted nothing to do with them, so they couldn't restock with food and supplies, but had to keep on going, all the way back to Spain. By the time they arrived back, they were broken. They'd lived out the harsh intentions they'd been intent on inflicting on so many others. The whole thing was a miracle. The largest fleet to ever set sail, just gone with the wind. A miracle, no less.
Nice story, Esmeralda whispers, still clearly wondering where it's all going. Is that the official story? Yes and no. The official story gives credit to the skill of the English Navy and cunning intelligence and all sorts, even though we tried to do a similar thing barely a year later and had a similar failure. Not on the scale of the Armada, of course. Few are truly willing to see the elephant in the room there, though. Which is what? A miracle. A message from the creator of this world to the warlords that apparently run it. I think God or whatever intelligence created this earth works a bit like our government sometimes, to create one big thing over here, to conceal one big thing over there. Or perhaps make a big thing seem quite a small thing, in comparison to a staged, bigger thing anyway. You seriously believe it was a miracle? Yeah, he announces in a tone of plain fact. But whilst one miracle was occurring there, another was slipping in under the cover of darkness. A coded message. Shakespeare? No, he pauses. Grammar. Grammar? Yeah, English grammar. The first thing Tony Blair took out of the school curriculum because of who and what he's part of, because of what he is. Because he's Catholic, Esmeralda retorts. You're a Catholic, Esmeralda. Would you have done what he's done? I don't really know what he's done. He's been very foolish. He's led Britain into a trap where every country is dumping our currency and distancing themselves from us because of our stance of utter war. It's just like what happened before the Second World War, when the country was brought to his knees and Europe distanced itself from us. And the only way to get the support of America, or the Federal Reserve, was to adhere to taking Palestine off the Palestinians and giving it to the Jews, he sighs. Tony's just repeating a very old story. He uses the so-called word of God to ordain murder by telling those being groomed to kill they have God's blessing. He has ordained the religious dumping of depleted uranium in every Englishman's name on Muslim land, all in the name of a crime we know they did not commit. He has nothing to do with being Catholic whatsoever, Esmeralda. He's calling in the Inquisition again. I guess it's a big part of your history. It's being done in my name, Esmeralda. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, and probably in Iran next. And who do you think they'll blame? Well, and the connotations of that suddenly stop her in her tracks. No, but you're right. I'm only just waking up to my own history, Esmeralda. Perhaps that's why I'm so charged with it at the moment. And, well, perhaps because we're coming into something similar to that time now, maybe. An awakening. I mean, I see it through very rose-coloured spectacles. I know I do. And I don't know, maybe just because I'd heard of a Shakespeare conspiracy tale a long time ago, but I'd never seen the massive impact that all was playing out, how big the picture really is. I think the dates might have had a lot to do with the similarities of this time. Back in the time of Shakespeare, it was fast approaching 1666. Dates like that have religious extremists longing for the apocalypse to put them out of their misery. It's just like 2012. You think bad things will happen? Well, for instance, you could consider democracy an evolutionary step, as the House of Commons opened for business just over 40 years after 1666. It would have probably taken far longer if not for the fear of, well, religious extremists threatening to tear the country apart and plunge it back into the Dark Ages. Surely it's those in your House of Commons that vote for war. Surely that does not work. It's a contradiction, she states coldly in a dismissive tone. Well, yes and no. The idea is fantastic, but the reality is flawed. You see, it collects the votes, but only listens to about 5% of them, if even close to that. The rest are wasted, because there's no proportional representation. All that's needed is one tiny change in policy, one tiny bill like Henry's healthcare system to correct that. Tony made thousands of rules to restrict. All that is needed is just one tiny little bill to more accurately represent the will of the people. You know, just to check out if the remaining 95% of my country are totally down with burying Iran under depleted uranium, because they might one day become intelligent enough to bury, say, Iraq and Afghanistan under nuclear waste. Mr. Loco. Si, pero loco lindo. Was she a good woman, that Queen Elizabeth? Suddenly her Hispanic accent is loaded with seduction again, almost like she's savouring her like for Elizabeth and the pink serenity of girl power. I don't know really, but think of what she was up against. Think of that time, Esmeralda. Mary I, her Catholic sister-in-law, had been crowned Queen of England and had had Elizabeth arrested on charges of conspiring with Protestant rebels and locked up in the Tower of London under the sentence of death. Mary was pregnant, apparently about to give birth to an heir to the throne, but childbirth was a risky thing in those days. It's a risky thing in these days, Esmeralda interjects with a smirk. Well, exactly. If anything happened to her, Elizabeth would have been next in line. But Mary had a bump in the right place and the blessing of the Pope. Remember, this is a power struggle. It's not an attack on your faith. He tokes on the spliff that's just been passed to him. But Elizabeth's name had been smeared with every abominable crime on earth. You know, in the same light, I wonder if Mary Magdalene was really just a prostitute. You really think she was? Esmeralda stops to consider the comment and takes the spliff off Dobbs. But I thought you said Elizabeth didn't die. Well, she was locked in the Tower of London under orders of Mary, who was waiting for a mandate to chop off her head, just like my country looks for a mandate to bomb Iran or Syria. Same thing. It's a pipeline connection to the Mediterranean Sea and out to the world at large. Mary was the original Bloody Mary. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, who he divorced. Her continuing to live or bear an heir would have kept the country in Catholic hands, and the Inquisition, which had more than started again, would have gone out of control. A full-scale Catholic lockdown would have occurred, and the enactment of zero tolerance served on the people. Everyone is guilty all of the time. Mary was intent on enforcing a Catholic regime upon England. He pauses, knowing she's enjoying the tale, but obviously feeling slightly awkward. But was Elizabeth a bad woman? He pauses. Mary thought she was. There was Elizabeth, locked in the Tower of London on charges of conspiring with Protestant rebels, which is what her father, Henry VIII, had actually initiated with his divorce from Mary's mother in the first place. You'd think of all the people who should have most hated Henry for beheading his wives, it should have been Elizabeth herself, as it was her mother's head he chopped off first of all. And yet Bloody Mary's mother lived, but astonishingly, Elizabeth took on his cause. So in Catholic eyes, she had to die. He pauses, savouring the moment and preparing for the final denouncement before continuing. You like your history, don't you, she says, with the traits of a curious smile rising from the extremities of her lips. Well, And they're deciding not to mention his age. But it seems the Catholic's luck had just changed, like the wind once more, as the screams coming from the palace when Mary went into labour turned out not to be the cries of a woman giving birth, but of a woman dying of a massive tumour that had been growing in her womb. She died! Imagine, when those guards were marching up the spiral staircase to fetch Elizabeth from the Tower of London, she would have probably been expecting to be frog-marched before a Catholic court and sentenced to die immediately. During the celebration of the new heir, it would have been the perfect time to have Elizabeth executed. To conceal one big thing over here, with one big thing over there. Exactly. If Mary had given birth, the Renaissance for England would have ended there and then. As she heard those guards coming up the stairs to take her, she would have been on her hands and knees doing only one thing. Praying. Exactly. Probably like she'd never prayed before. I wonder what promises she made to God in that terrifying moment. I still don't see how it links to Shakespeare, though. Well, the Catholics ruled by divide and conquer, and the easiest things to exploit if you want to drive a wedge between people are things like their religious beliefs. The obvious rich and poor class thing, colour, creed, and of course, last but by no means least, language. England was a country already divided by the natural boundaries of numerous dialects across the land. The Shakespeare conspiracy story tells of a man who reached a level of wisdom where he found the whatever it takes to write the works of Shakespeare. Just think of the name, Shakespeare, like shaking a spear or stick. It was what the elders held in the great circles of our ancestors. Whoever held and shook the spear was demanding the right to say what was on their mind, freely, without interruption, to be heard. Shakespeare represented freedom of speech, something which the Catholic Church had all but banned. He was a genius, a wizard perhaps, who put together the works of Shakespeare, who wrote the whole thing and invented grammar. A complex lingual system that took elements of all the dialects and placed them together in a single language to unite the land against the common threat. Who was he then? Who was Shakespeare? Well, someone very clever, writing anonymously, probably Sir Francis Bacon, or a literary think tank headed by Sir Francis Bacon. But really, it's not so much who, it's how. As in, how did he, or she, indeed, obtain their wisdom? How did they harvest that talent? Who trained him or her to think like that? It's like a genius bolt of lightning. Where does that genius really come from? That's what my main character is searching for in the Amazon. He's searching for the same miracle that can stop the apocalypse. Nice story. How far have you got? She asked with a smile across her face. Oh, well, I've kind of got to the point where the main character just got to Lima and he's met this really kind of hot chick from Chile. It's a kind of really cheesy part of the book. I'm not sure how it's panning out yet. I don't believe in conspiracy theories. She says in a genuine tone of doubt that this story will be going in any lusty direction Dobbs may have on his mind, than truly doubt in conspiracy. Do they need to be believed? Can they not just exist in the stars, say, and just be considered? I'm beginning to doubt it's possible to believe in anything, he says as a mere matter of fact. Esmeralda appears to consider the notion. I suppose you think 9/11 was a conspiracy tale? No, not really. Conspiracy stories are cunning and clever. That was nothing more than the blundering blatancy of the real perpetrators to demand the world choose a side. To choose what side? War or peace, one or the other. In Bush's words, you're either with us or against us. He glances over to Agent 6 and the other girl, Nikki. Both are sitting on the far sun lounger, closer to the edge of the building. To no great surprise, Dobbs can see Agent 6's long face making a comeback. He's obviously enjoying the company, although it seems Nikki's perhaps a little more keen than he is. As Dobbs watches, Agent 6 pulls out his wallet to show her a photo of his partner and child back home. Always pulled out the red card, Dobbs thinks to himself. Nikki's looking a little confused, but the truth is that neither he nor Agent 6 are trying to pull, really. Dobbs tries not to laugh at the situation, but can't help it, and as he does so, Agent 6's face also breaks into laughter. Just then, Perlita comes stomping back up the stairs, looking pale and annoyed. She glances over at Agent 6 and shouts, "Es loco! Tu amigo!" Dobbs understands what she's saying just from the expression on her face. The Brigadier follows behind a few moments later, holding a couple of pizza boxes, and in a matter of minutes, all the girls have gathered on Dobbs's sun lounger, eating pizza. There's a strange sort of energy. The two main hottest male contenders have just exited the situation, by Dobbs's reckoning. The Brigadier has scared off his girl, and Agent 6 has been scared off on account of not wanting to make waves with his girlfriend. Dobbs is not really Esmeralda's type, plus he's in a relationship anyway, so really everyone's out of the picture. It's clear to Dobbs that all are craving a little bit of intimacy, but things don't really seem to be going in that direction, even though the flirt levels are cranked up so high. Agent 6 looks across at the girls huddled round Dobbs, and seeing he's chatting to Perlita now, shouts across in jest, "Watch it! Dobbs is cornering all the women!" Dobbs is about to laugh, but catches the Brigadier giving him the most ice-cold stare, full of rage, the likes of which he's not seen directed at him for really quite some time. Leaning closer, he seethes, "Don't go changing lanes, Dobbs."